In this discussion, we're going to explore the poetry of Emily Dickinson. It's difficult for me not to play favorites here. Dickinson might be my favorite writer of the pre-Civil War era in American literature. I wish we had an opportunity to do 5, 6, 7, 8 videos on Emily Dickinson's poetry, but we'll have to concern ourselves really with just one to give us a sense of what exactly Dickinson is doing in her poetry, insofar as we can tell that at all. So Emily Dickinson is recognized as one of our great American poets, but the fact that we have any of her poetry at all is something of a miracle. You may or may not know, because the name Dickinson sort of evokes certain images in the mind of the average American student. You may or may not know that she didn't publish much in her lifetime. And the poems that were published in her lifetime were largely published without her permission. The idea of Emily Dickinson is the eccentric, death-obsessed, woman dressed in white, recluse, living in an attic room, writing letters and poems and barely leaving the house at all. And to an extent, some of that is a well-earned reputation, because that is who she was. But Dickinson's also, highly engaged with the world around her. She was a deep and prolific reader. All of her contemporaries, their works, she made sure she read. She read newspapers. She wrote lots of letters, and she wrote 1,800 or so poems that she organized, she bound together, she left following her death. And it's only through a series of family members and friends intervening and making sure that this poetry ends up being published that she is somebody who is able to be appreciated today. It's kind of interesting because Dickinson's life and the time that she wrote, really falls into the era of this course. Most of the poems or a large number of the poems that she produced were produced during the years of the Civil War, the years before, and then the years after too. But her poems really didn't see wide distribution and wide publication until the end of the 19th century, and then they were reprinted and republished in the 20th century, early part of the 20th century. And so for many people, the first time that they really got a sense of who Dickinson was as a writer was decades after the Civil War. And so in a strange way, Dickinson is one of these figures who technically belongs in this course, but could really just as easily be studied in depth in American literature too, or even a course on the 20th century in American literature, because her influence extends out that far due to the strange publication cycle of her works. She's, in my estimation, perhaps tied only with Walt Whitman in terms of lasting influence of a 19th century poet on American literature. There's a lot about her poems that we don't understand. She wrote in a lot of voices, and so it's sometimes difficult to tell what is Dickinson's voice, if anything, in a poem, and what is that voice that she is assuming for the sake of the poems. It's also difficult sometimes to understand why the poems look the way that they do. And I'll just say here right now that this discussion will not talk about her random capitalization scheme, and it's not going to talk about the dashes or the punctuation. Those are interesting choices. I don't think there's any way that we'll ever fully know why she formatted her poems the way that she did in terms of capitalization and the dashes. So I think the best piece of advice that I can give you is just go with it, right? It does sometimes make the poems difficult to understand and work through because Dickinson writes in meter. Her favorite meter is the ballad structure. And so the ballad structure of poetic meter is what's called a modified 14er, where you have what's known as a quatrain, or a stanza that has 4 lines to it, and the first and the third lines are iambic tetrameter. In other words, 4 iambs. So that's the first and the third lines. And the second and the fourth lines are what are called iambic trimeter, 3 iambs. And we usually follow a rhyme scheme where the second and the fourth lines are the ones that are rhyming. So we typically have a rhyme here and a rhyme here. It's not always the case that is, and certainly Dickinson experiments with form. But if you think about a poem like, one of her most famous poems, number 479, and you can turn to the Norton Anthology of American Literature, the 10th edition, volume B, you can turn to page 1529 to read along with this poem with me. You can hear the ballad structure, the 4-3-4-3 structure, as I read the lines aloud. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of grazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only told. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day when I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Poem about the voice of somebody who is dying and is unaware of the journey that the carriage is taking with being driven by death. The horses' heads are pointed toward eternity. The carriage is going off toward an eternal life to follow death. But the rhythm here, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality, right? Nobody reads the poems like that. That's not a fun way to read Emily Dickinson, but it captures the ballad structure that Dickinson's poems are known for. This ballad structure is so common in American poetry and popular song that, when Dickinson's writing, a lot of her poems can fit the tune of something like Auld Lang Syne, right? Now, I have a cold, and even when I don't have a cold, I have a horrible singing voice. so you're not really going to get me to sing, awesomely here. But let me just give you the one stanza using the tune of Auld Lang Syne so you can hear what I'm talking about, right? Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me, and so on and so forth, right? And I'm lucky that I'm doing this Dickinson video on a day that I have a cold, so that I can even say, oh, I have a cold, and that's why I'm not very good at singing. But I wouldn't be good at singing any time. So the ballad structure in American poetry and song is commonly used for hymns in churches, and sometimes is used for poems that have a more of a bend toward childlike interests. And Dickinson's real innovation, or the real interesting thing that she's doing with form at this time, is she's fusing a very traditional poetic structure with a very untraditional poetic content. I asked you to read, 24 or so of the Dickinson poems. Really, all the poems that are excerpted here are certainly worth your time. And I really love R.W. Franklin's collection of Dickinson's poems. If you have an opportunity and want to read more of Dickinson's poetry, I strongly recommend that you check out R.W. Franklin's edited anthology of Dickinson's poems. Let's take a look at one of Dickinson's few published poems. And this is poem 112 on page 1512 of the Norton Anthology. So none of Dickinson's poems have titles. They are organized usually by numbers, and the numbers try to capture a sense of their chronology. It's not always perfect, but it's usually the scholar's best estimation captured by chronology. Sometimes you'll see the poems simply numbered, but of course when we're talking about poems as writers and readers and people discussing Dickinson's work, if I were to say to you, oh yes, poem 112, oh yes, I love poem 112, you wouldn't really know exactly what it is that I was talking about. So sometimes Dickinson's poems are simply listed by the first line of the poem. And to our wonderful luck, Dickinson knows how to write a hell of a first line in so many of her poems. This is poem number 112, is Success is Counted Sweetest. Success is counted sweetest by those who ne'er succeed. To comprehend a nectar requires sorest need. Not one of all the purple host who took the flag today can tell the definition so clear of victory as he defeated dying, on whose forbidden ear the distant strains of triumph burst agonized and clear. So I want to start our discussion of Dickinson's poems with this one because it's short, it's 12 lines, and it's a great example of one of the challenges that comes with reading Dickinson's poems. Because Dickinson is using meter, and she's often using these dashes and these capitals, one of the problems that people have when they read her poems is they're sometimes very glued to the stanza structure. And sometimes the poem seems to imply that you should be reading for the stanza structure, and then it doesn't really make any sense later when she sort of breaks out of the stanza structure. So let me say a little more about what I mean here with poem 112. Look at the first stanza of the poem. Success is counted sweetest by those who ne'er succeed. To comprehend a nectar requires sorest need. At the end of the first stanza comes a period, right? And the period here is functioning as the end of a complete thought. So the first stanza has two thoughts in it, two sentences in the first stanza. Success is counted sweetest by those who ne'er succeed. So the people who really value winning or success are the people who lose, right? If you win the race, there might be a little bit of a thrill to it, but you are never going to appreciate how great success can feel than if you don't come close to it, right? So success is counted sweetest by those who ne'er succeed. Ne'er means never, right? It's just the V is cut out to turn it into a one-syllable word for the metrical scheme here, right? So that completes the first thought in the first stanza. Now, the first stanza functions that way, so it might be normal for us to assume that the second stanza is also going to function that way, right? But notice, look at the end of the second stanza. There's no period. And at the start of the third stanza, we begin with as. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that the second and the third stanza are going to be linked in that way, but they are. So rather than read it as a full second stanza, take a break, come to the third stanza, the second stanza by itself and the third stanza by itself don't have as much sense as if the second and the third are put together. So I'm going to focus not on the lines as in the poetry now. I'm going to try to read it as the sentence, because the fifth line to the end of the poem is one whole sentence. It's one whole thought. So you have to look at the poem and try to follow along with the punctuation. This is where the dashes can make things difficult, because you want to kind of stop at the dash, or you want to sort of pause, or you want to think maybe it's a stand-in for something, and that can impede your ability to read and understand what Dickinson is up to. So let me read the second and the third stanza as one complete sentence and follow along that way and see if it's easier to understand what she's saying. Not one of all the purple host who took the flag today can tell the definition so clear of victory as he defeated, dying, on whose forbidden ear the distant strains of triumph burst agonized and clear. So what's she saying here? Not one of all the purple host who took the flag today, so none of anybody who won today, can tell the definition so clear of victory. Okay? Not one of the winners can define victory as clearly as the one who's defeated and dying, and on whose forbidden ear the distant strains of triumph burst agonized and clear. So the person who's losing but can hear the sound of people celebrating, or of a horn blasting, or there might be a more metaphoric resonance here of like the sound of the heavens opening as the dying and the soul is going to depart the body. But essentially, the person who's dying and is hearing the sounds of the horns of triumph, that person can define victory more clearly than the person who won, is the argument that Dickinson's making. But if you just read the second stanza in isolation and the third stanza in isolation, you're not going to get that full sense from the poem. So as you read the Dickinson poems, or reread the Dickinson poems, you got to keep that fact in mind. Another fact that you have to keep in mind is Dickinson loves playing with the syntax. So the syntax is the order of the words. And sometimes she plays with the syntax in order to have the words fit into a metrical pattern. Sometimes she plays with the syntax for the purposes of the rhyme. Sometimes she plays with the syntax neither for the rhyme nor the metrical pattern, and it's just playing with the syntax, right? So sometimes as you read, you need to slow down and try to figure out, where is the subject of the sentence? Where is the verb of the sentence? or the predicate of the sentence. What is the subject doing in the sentence? Right? Let's look at an example of this as a practice. How about poem 339 on page 1521? Again, this is known as poem 339, but we could also call it by its first line, which is a great first line, one of my all-time favorite first lines of Dickinson's. I like a look of agony. Another simple poem here, 8 lines. I like a look of agony because I know it's true. Men do not sham convulsion, nor simulate a throe. The eyes glaze once, and that is death, impossible to feign. The beads upon the forehead, by homely anguish strung. Okay, so those last lines, the beads upon the forehead, by homely anguish strung. Grammatically, we would probably want to rewrite that homely anguish strung the beads upon the forehead, right? The sweat that forms on the forehead, right? And then maybe even more, is impossible to feign part of that, or the eyes glaze once and that is death, impossible to feign. Although it's there's no dash maybe, or a piece of punctuation that would separate impossible to feign. So it's the anguish, I'm sorry, homely anguish strung the beads upon the forehead, impossible to feign. Or it's impossible to feign the beads that are strung on the forehead by anguish. That idea of like the sweat beads, or that stress, the way that somebody looks when they're not feeling well, that's impossible to fake, right? What she's saying is she likes this emotion because she knows it's true. She knows it's pure. She knows it's not faked, right? Smiles and happiness can be faked, but pain can't be faked. And so there's a sense in which we admire or appreciate the emotion because it's true. Now she's playing around with the word order here, but also notice she doesn't quite have a true rhyme scheme. She's rhyming true with throw, the throes of agony, right? And she's rhyming feign with strung. Now, none of these words rhyme with each other, right? This is an example of what we would call a slant rhyme, where the words themselves don't actually rhyme with each other, but they have enough letters characteristic to each other that it looks like maybe they should rhyme, or there's kind of an element of potential rhyming here, right? True and throw have, T, R, and E, even though they don't rhyme with each other. They've got the T, R, and the E, and then you've even got this R, U, E, and R, O, E, which are very similar to each other, but not exactly the same, right? Feign and strung also have the G and the N. Now they're sort of flipped around. They don't rhyme. It's not a rhyme at all, but there's something sort of visibly connecting the words together. And this is something that Dickinson really likes to do in her poetry. Not that she can't rhyme, because she often rhymes beautifully well in her poems. And so we know that she's playing around with words here. We might want to ask what she's trying to affect with the lines being slightly off like that. Let's see, we could go really anywhere in our selection of the poems, but let's look at poem number 407. This is on page 1526. One need not be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a house. The brain has corridors surpassing material place. Far safer of a midnight meeting external ghost than its interior confronting that cooler host. Far safer through an abbey gallop the stones a chase than unarmed one's a self encountered in lonesome place. Ourself behind ourself concealed should startle most. Assassin hidden our apartment be horror's least. The body borrows a revolver, he bolts the door, or looking a superior specter, or more. This is one of Dickinson's poems that I think is really suffused with a lot of Gothic elements. It's late for Gothic literature. It's the 1860s when this one is dated to, but it's certainly infused with some of the Gothic elements that we've talked about in our course. One need not be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a house, she says. It's not just houses that get haunted in the imagination of this poem, right? The brain has corridors surpassing material place. In other words, the brain is a more sophisticated architectural layout than a house, right? And if we imagine the idea of a huge mansion with lots of hallways and doorways and windows and secret passageways, right? And we think, oh, that looks just so spooky, that can be haunted. She says, oh, no. The brain has more corridors than a place like that. And so imagine how much the brain can be haunted with something. For safer of a midnight meeting, external ghost, than its interior confronting that cooler host, right? It's safer, in the imagination of this poem, to run into a ghost at midnight out in the world than to have the confrontation happen inside your brain. Far safer through an abbey gallop the stones a chase than unarmed one's a self-encounter in a lonesome place, right? It's safer to be, being chased in a churchyard with people, stones being thrown at you or whatever, than to confront yourself. Because the interior of the brain is scarier than any reality that's out in the world, right? Ourself behind ourself concealed. There's almost sort of like a proto-Freudian idea here, right? That she seems to be tapping into the fact that inside the brain, there's a layer of us that's hidden from another layer. That getting deep inside that brain is going to reveal something much more startling, much scarier than anything that we might be able to encounter, a murderer being hidden in an apartment as the line. Ourself behind ourself concealed should startle most. That's the thing that's scariest, she says. The body borrows a revolver, he bolts the door, or looking a superior specter or more, right? You get scared, you're in a physical place, right? You grab a gun, you lock the door, you think everything's gonna be okay. But what's happened here is you've actually overlooked the scariest thing of all, which is what's going on inside your brain. Kind of a creepy, spooky poem. But I think a poem that reveals the depths of thought that Dickinson gives so much of her poetry. And how absolutely fascinating she is. How she can take an ordinary concept and sort of turn it inside out. This is a unique literary capability that we haven't really looked too close at in our course so far. Here's another one of those like kind of Gothic style poems. It's a little unclear what the poem is talking about, but think about how it's working here. This is 477 on page 1529. He fumbles at your soul as players at the keys. Before they drop full music on, he stuns you by degrees. Prepares your brittle nature for the ethereal blow by fainter hammers further heard, then nearer, then so slow. Your breath has time to straighten, your brain to bubble cool, deals one imperial thunderbolt that scalps your naked soul. When winds hold forests in their paws, the universe is still. A lot of people have read the he here as God, perhaps literally God, or some sort of metaphor for God or divine power, right? The ability of God to act, just stun somebody in their tracks is captured here through metaphors of fumbling at the soul, like players on the key, like on a piano. The image here of hammers, the imagery here of the thunderbolt that can come through and scalps the naked soul, right? It's not just that the soul is clothed, that the soul's naked, it's vulnerable in its own way. And then we're adding on an additional layer of that, the scalping of the soul. Difficult poem to work through and figure out exactly what she's after here. And that, of course, is one of the interesting challenges of Dickinson, and the thing that makes Dickinson's scholars keep coming back and talking about these poems and debating their possible meanings, because sometimes it's not entirely clear who she's talking about. You have to use the context clues or inferences on the rest of the poem to figure out what she might be talking about. For example, 576 on the next page, on page 1531. Another puzzling poem because it's asking us to compare two comparisons, but it's unclear what order the comparisons should be taken in, right? The difference between despair and fear is like the one between the instant of a wreck and when the wreck has been. So the difference between despair and fear is the difference between the instant of a wreck and when the wreck has been. So the comparison that seems to be made here, despair and fear, but the moment of the wreck and then the post-wreck. Dickinson sets up the despair and fear and then wreck and post-wreck. It seems to imply that the wreck itself is despair and fear is the post-wreck, but it actually would seem to make more sense as the wreck is happening. That's when you feel fear, and then after the wreck, that's when you feel despair. So, is it that the words, the order of the language has been flipped for the sake of the meter? Or is it that the order of the language has been flipped because she's trying to say, well, yes, conventionally speaking, you would associate fear with the wreck and despair with after the wreck, but I actually wanted to associate fear and the wreck and despair and the wreck and fear and after the wreck. And if that's the case, then how does the meaning of the poem change? The rest of the poem continues. The mind is smooth, no motion, contented as the eye upon the forehead of a bust that knows it cannot see. There's no motion, contented as the eye upon the forehead of a bust. No motion, contented as the eye upon the forehead of a bust that knows it cannot see. So there's a certain satisfaction in not being able to see, a certain level of comfort in not being able to see, but how should we put those together with despair and fear and wreck and post-wreck? It's an interesting and challenging configuration. It might be a poem that you would want to take up for a close reading or for inclusion in your research paper as you start to connect themes across volume A and volume B of the anthology. There are a lot of famous poems of Dickinson's that I haven't really taken a close look at for the purposes of our course, just because it's possible you've come across them elsewhere, like I heard a fly buzz when I died, or The Brain is Wider Than the Sky. I love both of those poems very dearly, but they're more frequently taught for Dickinson than other poems. Let's take a look at poem 704. This is on page 1536. The date here is 1863. And I mentioned that many of Dickinson's poems were produced during the Civil War. More than 900 of her poems were written between the years of the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Dickinson seems to have a capacity, a tremendous capacity for empathy. She seems to be able to put herself in the perspective of somebody who's dying or somebody who's close to death. She has the capacity to put herself in the experience of an animal, or as in the poem, My Life Has Stood a Loaded Gun. She's in the perspective of a loaded gun. She's like, the poem is from the gun's perspective, right? Many people have read 704, My Portion is Defeat Today, as a poem in the voice of a soldier during the Civil War. My portion is defeat today, a paler luck than victory. Less paeans, fewer bells. The drums don't follow me with tunes. Defeat, a somewhat slower means more arduous than balls. 'Tis populous with bone and stain, and men too straight to stoop again, and piles of solid moan, and chips of blank in boyish eyes, and scraps of prayer and death's surprise, stamped visible in stone. I love that image. Too straight to stoop again, piles of solid moan, chips of blank, scraps of prayer, death's surprise, stamped visible in stone. The reference there is a tombstone, right? And the stamping that happens on the tombstone that accompanies the memorial of somebody upon their death. There's somewhat prouder over there. The trumpets tell it to the air, how different victory to him who has it, and the one who to have had it would have been contenteder to die. they're somewhat prouder over there. The trumpets tell it to the air. How different victory to him who has it than the one who, to have had it, would have been contenteder to die. So I have an inversion here at the end of this poem, as Dickinson will frequently do, propose an idea early in the poem, then twist it around and ask us to look at the other side of the idea. How different victory is to the person who has it than to the one who, to have had that victory, would have made it contenteder to die. And of course she's playing with language here, right? Contenteder is a perfect kind of language. Why did Dickinson not publish her poems? I mean, we don't really know the answer to that question. There is a poem that reflects on her thoughts around publication, though, and it's poem 788 on page 1593. She writes, "Publication is the auction of the mind to man, the mind of man." Auction here implies selling, a bidding to a price, right? Publication is the auction of the mind of man. You're selling your mind when you publish. Poverty be justifying for so foul a thing. So she's referring to the publication. Publishing for money is the foul thing here, right? Poverty is preferable to it. Possibly, but we would gather from our garret go, white unto the white creator, then invest our snow. Thought belongs to him who gave it, then to him who bare it. Its corporeal illustration, sell the royal air. And the idea here that the mind, what the mind is generating, is a divine, the divine presence in the body. The capacity of the human mind is a gift from God. And so to take that and then to sell it is to sell what's been given to people by God. It's almost like you're trying to sell the air around you, right? I mean, it's a gift, not something to sell. In the parcel be the merchant of the heavenly grace, but reduce no human spirit to disgrace of price. So in the parcel, right, in the poem itself, in the work of creativity, in the art, is the presence of God, right? And we shouldn't reduce human spirit to be able to be auctioned off or have a price associated with it. But I think the interesting thing about Dickinson is that she leaves her poems assembled. She would take these white pieces of paper and she would delicately write out the poems in pencil, and then she would go over that in ink. So there's a real careful attention to the writing that she's doing. All other versions of the poem or all old drafts of the poem were destroyed, so that it was only left with the final version that she wanted. And then she would stack these white pieces of paper and then tie the edges to create booklets. And then upon her death, she left all of these with her desk. So there's a strange sort of idea here where she doesn't publish, true, but also she seems to be preparing her manuscripts for consideration at a later date. Is she compiling them for posterity? Is she compiling them for someone she loves to have and read? Was she compiling them to be published after her death? It's one of the great questions that we can't fully understand. It's one of many great questions associated with Dickinson that we can't understand completely. And one of the reasons that she gets us, I think, to keep coming back and coming back and coming back. One more poem here in our discussion of Dickinson. It's one of the last ones in your selections on page 1544. It's poem 1773. My life closed twice before its close. It yet remains to see if immortality unveil a third event to me. So huge, so hopeless to conceive as these that twice befell. Parting is all we know of heaven and all we need of hell. There's not a word out of place in this poem. It's perfectly tight, right? In so many ways, Dickinson is kind of the anti-Whitman, right? Whitman's got words all over the place. He's boundless with words. He's got this infinitude of words. He can't seem to get enough words out, right? And Dickinson, writing at the same time but on another part of the country, is trying to present these poems almost with as few words as possible to convey the wonderful idea. And sometimes what that means is we don't quite understand what she's talking about. My life closed twice before it's closed. How can it close twice before it closes once? Right? That doesn't really make any sense. But then what if maybe what she's referring here is my life closed twice before it's closed? She suffered maybe the loss of two people that she loved. So she's still alive, right? Her life hasn't ended, but the lives of people that she loved have ended. And that almost feels like death. Perhaps that's what it means. We don't know entirely for certain, but that might be what it means, right? And yet it remains to see if immortality unveil a third event to me, right? Maybe is somebody else I love is going to die before I die. Is that maybe what she's saying? So huge, so hopeless to conceive as these that twice befell. That's the closing twice, right? Parting is all we know of heaven and all we need of hell. So we might read those lines to be like, the hope that a parted loved one, will go to heaven, but then also the parting of the loved one from you is kind of like all you need of hell, right? It's a loneliness, a sadness that feels almost impossible to bear. Is one reading of this poem, right? Many other readings are possible that we can add to it, or we could engage Dickinson with. It's one of the beauties of her poems that they welcome so much interpretation, so much debate, and so much discussion. We've covered just a few of her hundreds and hundreds of poems, and so I hope you have an opportunity to read more Dickinson in your time, and think about Dickinson and Whitman as sort of two sides of an American literature coin, right? Dickinson innovates by being narrow, by being a little obtuse, by being very precise, by being very Spartan in her language, and Whitman innovates by the largeness of his poems. And in that way, they work very well together. They balance each other very well because they're both highly influential, but they're doing very different things. In our next discussion, we're going to talk about Native American rhetoric of resistance as we continue our discussion here on marginalized voices in the 19th century.